Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Are you thinking of upgrading to a new 1440p OLED gaming monitor but can't decide whether you should get a QD-OLED or WOLED variant? Well, you've come to the right place because today's video is going to provide an in-depth comparison between the two main variants to show you exactly which panel is better in which scenarios, including some side-by-side visuals that we haven't shown in reviews before. As it currently stands in 2024, there are two main 1440p panels offering OLED technology. A 27-inch 240Hz WOLED from LG Display, and a 27-inch 360Hz QD-OLED from Samsung Display. The WOLED variant has been around for a while now. We saw the first monitors using this panel at the start of 2023, while the QD-OLED variant is brand new in 2024 and provides direct competition as it's offering the same size, aspect ratio, and resolution. So what even is QD-OLED and WOLED? Well, they are both subvariants of OLED displays, or organic light-emitting diode displays. This refers to how the display panel produces light. OLED panels directly emit light from a layer of organic diodes, millions of diodes per panel. All OLED panels, whether we're talking QD-OLED or WOLED, function in this way and provide several key benefits. As OLEDs directly emit light from each pixel, every pixel is able to control its light output individually, giving us per pixel local dimming, a key feature to brilliant HDR presentations. OLEDs are also able to fully switch off individual pixels to display black, leading to deep, zero-level blacks and rich shadows. If you haven't used an OLED monitor before, the most obvious comparison is to an LCD. Liquid crystal displays feature a backlight that emits light, which then passes through a layer of crystals that twist to control color and brightness output. As LCD backlights are either uniform or split into zones, LCDs do not have per pixel control, so you don't get per pixel local dimming or the ability to switch off individual pixels. The crystal transition process in an LCD is also typically slower than an OLED, modifying the light output of a given pixel. In short, the usual features buyers desire from an OLED are its per pixel control and its transition speed, features you get with both WOLED and QD-OLED. Where the OLED subvariants differ is in their panel composition and subpixel structure. WOLED uses an OLED layer that emits white light, which then passes through color filters to display red, green, and blue. In addition, there's a fourth subpixel with no filter passing through the white light of the OLED layer. This white OLED design with its fourth white subpixel gives WOLED its name. It means white OLED. QD-OLED operates differently. The OLED layer in a QD-OLED emits blue light, which passes through a quantum dot layer, modifying the light wavelength to red and green for the red and green subpixels. The blue subpixel passes through the blue OLED light. QD-OLEDs therefore only have 3 subpixels, and these are arranged in a triangle configuration with green on top and red and blue on the bottom. The QD in QD-OLED refers to the quantum dot layer that's key to its design. While the underlying technology is still OLED, the way WOLED and QD-OLED panels operate is significantly different, which leads to many differences in performance and other display characteristics. So let's break down the differences as it relates to these 1440p panels. Today's 1440p QD-OLED and WOLED panels do differ in motion performance, though this is entirely due to the difference in refresh rate. QD-OLED panels can push up to an astonishing 360Hz, while WOLED is capped at 240Hz, still a very high refresh rate, but not quite as high as QD-OLED. This means that when comparing maximum versus maximum refresh rate performance, the QD-OLED is a little clearer in motion because the higher refresh rate leads to less sample and hold motion blur. The differences can be subtle, as you can see from this Blurbuster's UFO test, but the text is slightly more readable in the 360Hz image and the clarity in the UFO body is superior. 360Hz QD-OLED also provides increased smoothness over 240Hz WOLED, as its maximum refresh rate is simply showing more images per second. In addition to this, there is slightly less input lag at 360Hz, as the refresh lag component is lower compared to 240Hz, so today's QD-OLED screens are a bit more responsive for competitive gaming. What's really important to know though, is that QD-OLED only has an advantage in motion performance over WOLED above 240Hz. If you're planning to use your monitor at a lower refresh rate, such as 240Hz, 160Hz, 120Hz or whatever, WOLED and QD-OLED will look essentially identical. This is because both OLED technologies deliver near identical response times, so when they are run at the same refresh rate, neither has an advantage. It's not the case that because the QD-OLED panel can reach 360Hz, that gaming at, say, 120Hz will also be faster. Everything being equal, refresh rate, frame rate, etc., motion performance and input lag will be effectively equal whether you go WOLED or QD-OLED. This is critical knowledge for people planning to use a 1440p OLED monitor primarily for single-player HDR gaming where frame rates are expected to be lower. For motion performance, it makes little difference which way you go if you're planning to play games around 60 to 120 FPS. Conversely, the higher 360Hz refresh rate of QD-OLED panels is of benefit to competitive gamers which can realistically run games at above 240 FPS. There's plenty of titles out there like Counter-Strike and Valorant that can be played at ridiculously high frame rates, and that's where QD-OLED shines. Brightness is always a significant talking point when it comes to OLED, as this is a known weakness compared to LCDs, and there are notable differences between QD-OLED and WOLED brightness. QD-OLEDs are much more consistent in their brightness characteristics between various manufacturers using the same panel. So whether you get the MSI MPG271QRX or the Dell Alienware AW2725DF, both offer around 230 to 250 nits of peak SDR brightness, and I expect that to be the same with any other models using this panel. WOLED brightness varies substantially between models. I've seen results ranging anywhere from 130 nits of peak SDR brightness with the initial firmware of the Corsair Xeneon 27QHD240 up to 260 nits for the AOC Agon Pro AG276QZD. So the best WOLED panels are capable of similar SDR brightness to QD-OLED panels, but this isn't the case for all models, so be sure to check reviews. The same thoughts also apply for HDR brightness. QD-OLEDs are much more consistent between monitor manufacturers, whereas WOLEDs vary more. The Asus ROG Swift PG27AQDM, for example, gets much brighter across the board for HDR compared to the LG 27GR95QE. I've seen greater than a 200 nit difference in some situations between the top and bottom WOLEDs. Speaking generally though, QD-OLEDs do provide superior HDR brightness most of the time. For the brightest highlights at a 2% window size, the 1440p QD-OLEDs I've tested so far hit around 1000 nits, whereas the best WOLED, the Asus PG27AQDM, tops out at 900 nits. Several other WOLED models I've tested only reach around 750 nits under these conditions. QD-OLEDs also deliver higher brightness in high APL scenes. Again, there's variance between the models for WOLED, but typically a QD-OLED is capable of at least 50 nits more brightness in these conditions. However, there are some scenarios where WOLED is able to take the brightness crown, and that's usually when measuring around a 10% window size. QD-OLEDs are at their weakest here, only being capable of around 470 nits. The PG27AQDM can push up to 900 nits in these scenarios, while other WOLEDs sit around 650 nits. Across a variety of real-world tests though, we've typically found that QD-OLEDs produce higher brightness, which does lead to better HDR performance, and this is especially true relative to most of the WOLEDs that we've tested. The Asus PG27AQDM is a bit of an outlier with its especially high performance, but even then, it usually isn't quite as good as a QD-OLED. What we've talked about so far has been largely related to white level brightness, which is enhanced on WOLED screens thanks to its white subpixel. QD-OLEDs take an even larger lead for color brightness. Typically what I've seen is that color brightness on a QD-OLED is more than twice as high as on a WOLED, even comparing the best examples of WOLED to the latest QD-OLEDs. This leads to a significant advantage for QD-OLED in color volume. Based on low APL testing that has both panels producing their brightest brights, QD-OLED achieves around 73% Rec 2020 color volume compared to just 44% for WOLED. The advantage clearly goes to QD-OLED for displaying the largest amount of the HDR color and brightness range. There's a less significant difference in color space coverage though. WOLED typically sits around 72 to 73% Rec 2020 color space coverage, whereas QD-OLED is in the 80% range. So while QD-OLEDs can display a larger range of colors than WOLED, when brightness isn't factored in, both panel types do offer a wide color gamut that's suitable for HDR. Text clarity is a big talking point with OLED monitors, as currently all OLED panels use a non-standard subpixel layout that Windows doesn't work well with, at least relative to LCDs. While text clarity is approaching a non-issue on higher pixel density 4K panels, today's 1440p screens are still only around 110 ppi, low enough that various artifacts are visible during everyday usage. With the latest 27-inch 1440p panels, QD-OLED and WOLED do render text differently. This is due to a different subpixel structure between the two. WOLED uses RWBG in a stripe configuration, whereas QD-OLED uses triangle RGB with the green subpixel above the red and blue. Windows uses subpixel text rendering techniques to improve text quality, and these techniques are designed around traditional RGB stripe subpixel layouts you see in LCD panels. Any deviation away from RGB stripe leads to weaker text quality, and both QD-OLED and WOLED offer different layouts to RGB stripe. The artifacts you see from QD-OLED and WOLED differ. QD-OLED has text fringing issues, where you see a faint green fringe at the top of text and a faint pink fringe at the bottom of text. WOLED has shadowing issues that typically present along the left and right edges of text, making text appear less crisp or defined as edge quality is reduced. I think both of these artifacts are noticeable, though the degree to which they are noticeable varies. QD-OLED text fringing, in my opinion, is harder to spot, and based on user reports, some people find the issue not particularly problematic. I think the easiest way to see fringing is if you happen to be using a QD-OLED beside a regular LCD in a dual monitor setup. The difference in text quality between the two panels will expose the pink-green fringing. If you're sensitive to artifacts like chromatic aberration, you might also find yourself immediately noticing this issue because you're accustomed to spotting similar sorts of artifacts. WOLED shadowing and edge quality issues are more noticeable, and it doesn't require an LCD reference display to expose these problems. It's pretty likely when viewing a 1440p WOLED that you'll find the text quality a bit soft and lacking in definition. The smaller the text is on screen, the worse text quality becomes, but even for larger font sizes, I find these WOLED panels to be unimpressive. Ultimately, in my opinion, I think QD-OLED text quality is clearly superior to WOLED for 1440p panels. The differences are not an issue for gaming or content consumption, so if that's what you'll be doing most of the time, I wouldn't worry too much about the subpixel structure and text quality. But if you're thinking of mixing in a bit of web browsing, maybe some light productivity work, writing a few emails, editing some documents, QD-OLED is definitely the more pleasant experience. The screen coating used for QD-OLED and WOLED is substantially different. QD-OLED uses a glossy coating for the monitors released so far, whereas WOLED uses a matte coating, and LG Display's choice to go with matte for their panels has been reasonably controversial. However, in my experience, whether glossy or matte is better can be highly subjective, and it could depend on how you use your monitor. WOLEDs use a screen coating and panel composition that is more effective in brighter ambient environments. The use of various filters results in less reflection of ambient light, preserving the deep blacks of OLED in more conditions. In brighter environments, especially with lighting in front of the display, this type of matte WOLED will appear to have deeper blacks than a glossy QD-OLED. In a side-by-side comparison, you can clearly see the blacker appearance of WOLED when showing black compared to the red-grey of QD-OLED, which is reflecting more ambient light. The matte finish also helps WOLED reduce defined mirror reflections compared to QD-OLED. In bright environments, it's possible to clearly see some objects reflected in a glossy QD-OLED display, and this is especially problematic if there's bright objects like lights or windows opposite your monitor. On a WOLED, these elements will be diffused and less distracting, although any light is generally still reflected to some degree. The glossy finish on QD-OLED is also one of the better coatings for minimizing mirror reflections even if they are still present. On the other hand, there are some setups where QD-OLED will be preferable. Optimizing light placement to avoid light sources shining on the display will greatly reduce ambient light reflectivity, and it is possible in some cases to get QD-OLED reflecting less light in general, making use of the glossy finish's ability to prevent diffusing light. This will be a case-by-case basis though, and could take some work to optimize. But generally, if you can get light sources largely behind the display, QD-OLED will end up looking better than the matte WOLED coating, as there is no coating grain. This gives QD-OLED the appearance of greater clarity and a more crisp presentation. With no noticeable light diffusion, it also enhances the apparent contrast in some situations, providing more pop to vibrant high-contrast scenes. The WOLED coating grain is moderate in nature and can be noticeable in some situations, though personally I don't find it that annoying. In a dark environment such as gaming with the lights off, there's really not much of a difference between QD-OLED and WOLED except for coating grain. Both panel types will produce the same rich zero-level blacks with no ambient light in the room. The matte finish does not impact blacks in this sort of environment, and neither does the QD-OLED panel's poor handling of ambient light reflections. To summarize the difference in coating though, generally you'll want a matte coating if you're mostly going to use the monitor in a brighter environment, and a glossy coating when using it in mostly a darker or light optimized environment. Both QD-OLED and WOLED variants offer similar viewing angles, excellent in both cases with little fall off to colors or brightness when viewing at off angles. Both panel types have excellent edge-to-edge uniformity due to their high viewing angles, so at a typical viewing position there's no obvious issues viewing the corners of the screen. While generally uniformity is quite good with both WOLED and QD-OLED, for dark grey shades WOLED can suffer from artifact issues we label the dirty screen effect. This is difficult to capture on camera, but basically when viewing large uniform sections of dark grey like you get in some applications, QD-OLED will show these sections clean with great uniformity, whereas WOLED has a bit of dirty speckling and banding that makes these sections less uniform. It's a minor annoyance that may affect some applications, but as large grey sections like this are uncommon in video content or gaming, it won't affect many of the typical OLED use cases. Other aspects to performance will largely come down to individual models and units. Color calibration is one example where this will differ depending on the brand, as will features like KVM switches, color space emulation modes, port selection, and burn-in warranties. It's important to check reviews for individual products so you're fully up to speed on all the nuances with each manufacturer's offerings. Overall, when choosing a new 27-inch 1440p OLED monitor, you'll need to decide whether to go QD-OLED or WOLED, and there's more to consider than might first appear. The two panels on the market right now are based on the same sort of underlying technology, but the implementation, performance, and features can be quite different. The main similarities relate to the fundamental aspects of OLED. Response times and motion performance are the same at the same refresh rate, and both variants offer deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming, leading to excellent HDR presentations. We're also faced with the same excellent viewing angles and a similar risk of burn-in. We just don't have the evidence yet to say which OLED technology is more resilient. There are also going to be areas which will come down to the individual models offered by the various monitor manufacturers. Calibration in both the SDR and HDR modes, brightness accuracy, port selection, additional processing features, burn-in warranties, and so on are all controlled by the OEM and will differ between models even if they use the same panel, so as always, check reviews. When we start to talk about the differences though, I think the 27-inch 360Hz QD-OLED panel clearly comes out on top. The main reasons for this are its higher refresh rate, typically higher brightness across both SDR and HDR applications, better text quality, better uniformity, wider color gamut and volume, and its glossy screen coating, which many users prefer. WOLED has relatively few advantages over QD-OLED comparing these two panels, though the matte screen coating does have its place in brighter environments. How much of an impact these differences make does vary. For example, the higher refresh rate of QD-OLED is only relevant for people actually planning to play games above 240 FPS. At the same refresh rate, both technologies deliver a similar motion experience. Conversely, the better text quality of QD-OLED I believe has a clear impact on non-content consumption use cases, and the better brightness characteristics have an advantage when gaming or watching HDR videos. With brightness in particular, it heavily depends on the specific WOLED monitor we're talking about. The Asus PG27AQDM gets closer to matching QD-OLED brightness performance and at times even has an advantage, but other models such as those from LG and Acer fail to reach the same heights and can end up quite a bit dimmer, even for SDR use cases. The 1440p QD-OLEDs I've tested so far have been much more consistent, and given all the other testing I've done across other formats that use QD-OLED, I expect that to be true for upcoming models as well. While the QD-OLED panel is the winner here in terms of performance and features, it's not always going to be the best choice for buyers, and that's because it is the more expensive technology. As of right now, you're looking at about $800 to $900 US for a 1440p QD-OLED versus $650 to $800 US for a 1440p WOLED. At the same price, it's a no-brainer. The QD-OLED is the way to go, but the QD-OLED premium in other situations could be as much as 40%. Depending on your preference and how you prioritize features and performance, a cheaper WOLED monitor could still be a great choice. Later this year, the discussion around 1440p OLED panels could change though, because LG's panel roadmap includes new 1440p 480Hz variants. That's going to change things up for motion performance at the very least, and hopefully those new panels also bring improvements to some of the other weak areas to WOLED. Anyway, that's it for this look at 1440p WOLED versus 1440p QD-OLED. Hopefully most of the questions that you have about these two different panel technologies have been answered throughout this video. If you do want to support the monitor testing that we do here at Hardware Unboxed and Monitors Unboxed, then please do consider supporting us via our Patreon or Floatplane accounts. Links are in the description below. Doing so will gain access to a great place to get monitor recommendations, which is our Discord community. If you pop in there and you ask a question, it'll get answered usually pretty quickly by some very knowledgeable members, or even me if I'm around and have time to do so. Also, it's very important with QD-OLED and WOLED monitors to look at individual reviews, and we have plenty of those right here on the channel. So if you are thinking about buying a specific variant that we've been talking about, then yeah, we have much more in-depth testing in those reviews that goes into exactly what you're getting with those products. So check those out as well. Anyway, that's it for this one. I'll catch you in the next one.